Okay, guys, so we are going to be talking about the theorists that come after Freud, but that are still connected to Freud. And I just want to take a moment here to talk about this idea of psychodynamic theorists. So, that Freud is connected with psychoanalysis, but that the theorists that come right after him and that take parts of his theory, but not all of his theory, are called psychodynamic. And you guys have a sheet that you're working on with small groups that think about what makes each of these theorists psychodynamic. But let's just talk about that term for a moment. Psychodynamic just refers to theorists or theories that have some basic assumptions. So one of the assumptions is that there is unconscious process in some way, that some of the motivation and dynamics of our behavior are happening outside of our conscious awareness. Most psychodynamic theories also have some emphasis, though not all as strongly as Freud, on the importance of childhood. And so that's going to be a common theme among these theories as well. And so we're going to look at each one of these and think about what they have in common with Freud, but also, more importantly, what they each have as a unique offering. And the first one we're going to look at here is Jung, Carl Jung, and it is Jung, not Jung, because he's German. Well, he was born in Switzerland, but he spoke German. Jung pursues his career path mostly because of his interest in spiritual phenomena, and he gets really interested while he's in college in several experiences he has that he thinks are spiritual in nature, and decides psychiatry would allow him to be both to combine that spiritual and biological experience of human nature. And Jung becomes Freud's heir apparent. And what I mean by that is that Freud assumed for many years that Jung would take over his very classic ideas of psychoanalysis and just continue to bring Freud's theories and ideas into the future. But Jung had some basic disagreements with Freud. And probably among the most important of those was he thought Freud overemphasized sexuality, which some of you may agree with. And he also thought that the unconscious was not necessarily just that seething cauldron of unacceptable stuff. He thought the unconscious had a more positive role to play in personality and in our functioning than Freud believed. But in 1909, when Freud made his only trip to the United States, he actually came at the invitation of William James and came to Massachusetts for one of his only, Worcester, Massachusetts, for one of his only visits to the United States. He brings Jung with him, and they travel, of course, by boat, and they spend lots of time together. But then by 1913, just 4 years later, they have split and never speak again because of Jung's refusal to give up his more spiritual ideas. Freud called it occultism. And they never speak again, and Jung goes on to build his own theory apart from Freud. And some of the basic ideas that he brings to that theory are the ones that we talked about just a few minutes ago, right? So his theory does incorporate more of the person's what he called aims and aspirations. So the idea that the person has more direct influence on how they behave and what their personality is like. And overall, this is just a more optimistic theory than Freud's, with more room for personal choice. And he does de-emphasize sexuality. As we go through this, we won't talk much about sexuality. And he then adds what he is most known for, which is his large emphasis on ancestral history. That the idea that we inherit a certain species-specific way of being, and we'll talk more about that as the collective unconscious, but that is passed down to us in a large piece of our experience. So for Jung, he talked about the term self to talk about personality, and saw the ego as being less about controlling the other personality structures, and saw it as our conscious mind. And here's where we get to the important part, or the main part, which is that he really saw the unconscious as having two parts. The personal unconscious essentially was the same as Freud's ideas of the personal unconscious, but then he also focused a lot on the collective unconscious. And the personal unconscious for Jung, just to pause and talk about that for just a minute, he does think about fixations in similar ways as Freud, but calls them complexes. But these are things that have been important to our past and that where we have kind of psychological energy tied up. And within that personal unconscious, two important things to think about and take a closer look at in the reading is the idea of a persona, which is the mask that we adopt for society. So essentially, this is the part of our personality that we have accepted and connected with and identified with and find acceptable. And then that is contrasted to the shadow, which is the parts of our personality that are repressed, that are hidden, that are neglected, or that we've decided are unacceptable in some way, either to ourselves or we believe to society, right? And so that shadow looks a lot like Freud's idea of the unconscious, with the unacceptable stuff being forced into the unconscious. But then we have this collective unconscious that is one of Jung's, probably the most interesting thing that Jung offers. So it's one of the most interesting things and most unique things that Jung offers to us. And according to Jung, the collective unconscious consists of latent or kind of unseen memories from our ancestral past. So these aren't actually memories. It's not about past lives, but it is about predispositions to certain behaviors. And this actually comes very close to what modern psychologists would probably talk about in evolutionary psychology, in some ways at least, though there is this more spiritual piece of it that Jung does focus on. He also talks, he's very focused in the collective unconscious about myths and symbols that we respond to because of the collective unconscious that are common across cultures. And he called these archetypes. And these archetypes are symbols that if we look across cultures and look at stories in those cultures, look at myths in those cultures, sorry guys, I'm just going to move this image up here, and look at myths in those cultures, that we are going to see very common symbols. And so I have some examples listed here on the slide, but even the idea of a father God, which I don't think is listed here, right, is a very thing that we see across cultures. And for Jung, those stories and now our movies, right, our plays that deal with these common archetypes allow us to deal with our collective unconscious in direct ways, and Jung saw that as a very healthy thing. He also thought that dreams reflected archetypal imagery, which is why I remember when we talked about Freud and dreams, we talked about dreams being very personal and reflective of your unique unconscious material. Jung comes closer to that idea of dream diary that some of you are familiar with, and it doesn't necessarily give us dream diaries that you buy in the supermarket, but the idea that there are some symbols in dreams that will have the same meaning regardless of who you are because they're archetypal symbols that we all respond to. And I think I might have mentioned when we were talking in class, the book Bruno Bettelheim's Uses of Enchantment. And Uses of Enchantment really does take this idea and look at fairy tales as a way for children to deal directly with things that might otherwise be overwhelming, but that deal directly with them by looking at archetypal symbols that fairy tales give us. Fairy tales are often used as a really good example of archetypal symbols, as is religion, because we do see some important similarities across cultures for those things. So some other Jungian ideas that are just interesting to think about. Jung, again, right, has this focus on the spiritual, what Freud called the occult, and he's willing to think outside the box of what typical psychologists think about. So one of these ideas is synchronicity, the idea that sometimes coincidences for Jung do seem to have meaning, that if you come across the same experience over and over, or idea over and over, or things happen in your life and somebody else's life similarly and at the same time, that he says that these are a result of our shared collective unconscious. He actually saw that as important spiritual phenomena. And then, kind of very different than that, Jung also gives us the precursors to our big five, the idea that we fall in a continuum on a series of personality traits. And introversion, extroversion is the one of those that stays most closely, obviously, in our big five. But then he also talked about us functioning on a continuum of sensation and intuition, or thinking and feeling, and that shaped our personality. And so it really does, in some important ways, give us this precursor to our current ways of thinking about personality traits. So hopefully you've read some. So often students get really interested in reading more about Jung. And Jung's original writings, as Freud's are as well, are really available in these little paperbacks that are inexpensive. They'll be in lots of libraries, but they're also inexpensive to find if you want to buy them. And so think about doing that. Have a good day, guys.